Welcome to the third episode of the French Defense Speedrun here. In this particular episode, we are going to be focusing on playing against players who are in the rating range of 800 to 900. We are going to be seeing a couple of different games where I'm able to gain a space advantage in the center of the board, playing around having more space than my opponent, how to play on the side of the board where you are better and having a pawn majority. We'll also see situations where we're able to take advantage of our opponent's opening inaccuracies, where they give up one of their bishops for one of my knights, and then how we can play with bishop pair advantage after that. And in another one of the games, we're going to be seeing how we can use a lead in development in order to punish the opponent who is bringing their queen out early in the game. So let's jump right into the games and hope you enjoy them. All right, so we've got our first game of this particular video against the move e4. We're going with our French defense. We're against Benamarut from Catalonia. So e4, e6, they go for knight c3. We are going for our tried and true d5 move, grabbing space in the center. White plays the move knight f3. I think we've seen this in at least one of the other games in the speedrun series so far. So usually when white is not preventing us from pushing the pawn up to the d4 square, for example, they have not put a pawn on d4 themselves, we are just going to go ahead and advance that pawn, grab the space, and attack the knight. So this knight needs to move off of the c3 square. It goes back, in this case, to the e2 square, attacking the pawn. Here we can go for the move c5 to reinforce the pawn on d4. And the general game plan here is to go something like knight to c6, e5, develop the bishop, and have our pretty big space advantage in the middle of the board, and be pretty happy about it. So here white plays knight e5. So this is a bit of an unusual move. I don't think this is that good of a move. First of all, there's multiple ways to attack this knight in the center of the board. So what are we going to do against this is the question. So it is preventing us from playing knight c6, I will say. If we go knight c6, white will trade the knights. We end up having doubled pawns. Not really an ideal circumstance, I would say. So what are we going to do against this? So bishop to d6 looks reasonable to attack the knight. Pawn to f6 looks reasonable to attack the knight. Normally you want to be very cautious about moving your f-pawn early in the game, but I don't really see a way for white to punish that. Sometimes when you push the f-pawn, they'll have like a queen h5 check that will be a big issue. But in this particular version of things, the knight on e2 is blocking the queen from getting the h5, so that's not really all that much of a concern. We could also simply go knight f6, develop and attack the pawn in the center. That also looks pretty good. Bishop d6, I'm a little bit less of a fan of because they'll go knight to c4 and counterattack the bishop, and we'll have to move the bishop another time. So I'm actually liking the f6 move, but there are some things we have to be a little bit cautious about. I mean, of course, the king being a little bit more exposed is part of the thing to be cautious about. Is there anything else we can do that I'm not identifying? Maybe queen to c7 is also looking quite good. I'm actually liking queen c7 the more I look at it. We're attacking the knight. If the knight moves away, we can push the pawn up to e5, which is part of the idea of f6 in the first place. You kick the knight somewhere, and then you play the move pawn to e5. But queen c7 also develops a piece, which is generally pretty good. And if the knight moves away, then we can push the pawn. If the knight gets defended, let's say they play something like f4, then we can play bishop d6, and behind the knight is also the pawn on f4 that might be a potential target. Yeah, I think I'm going to go for the queen c7 move. I also don't want to overthink the position. We thought for about 2.5 minutes there, and it is a 10-minute game, so that's about, close to a quarter of our time. So I think queen c7 looks solid enough. We'll see what white does about the knight in the center of the board being attacked. Probably. Okay, they go back to the c4 square. So in this position here, I could go b5 and kick the knight all the way back to the a3 square, which looks like a very bad location for the knight to be stuck on. I'm liking the look of that. I like the thought of putting the knight off on the edge of the board without really any big repercussion. So I think I'm going to go for that route. I'm going to kick the knight. It's going to go back to a3, and then I'm going to play the move a6 to reinforce the pawn. And then that knight on a3 is just going to be in a very awkward location. So we'll go a6 to protect the pawn. I don't want to go b4 here and attack the knight once again. You might think, oh, I can continue kicking the knight and making threats. That must be good. But if I go b4, then the knight goes right back to the c4 square, and it becomes a lot more difficult to get the knight off of c4 when both the b pawn and the d pawn have advanced. So okay, they go for d3. Let's develop a new piece. Sounds like a good idea. I'm going to go for knight to c6. I am guessing that white's going to play bishop f4. I don't think it's a very good move, but I would not be surprised if they did that. If they do that, okay, so I'm a little bit of a 800 rated whisperer here, so to speak. So they're going bishop f4. However, this just allows us to push the pawn up to e5 to block off the diagonal and attack the bishop again. The bishop needs to move a second time, and we just have a massive space advantage, which is really restricting a lot of white's pieces. Like this knight on a3 we already talked about. This knight on e2, where is this guy going? Can't move forward to any of these squares because we cover those. The knight's going to have to go back to like c1 or g1. If this knight doesn't move, how is the bishop on f1 getting in the game? So this big space advantage is making it very difficult for the opponent to develop their pieces. That's really the biggest problem that they're facing here. So with that in mind, I'm just going to continue developing my own pieces. I'm going to go for bishop to... I think I'm going to go bishop to d6, just to reinforce the center. I'm also making it a little bit more difficult for white to attack my center, because if they go f4, I'll have a lot of stuff covering the f4 square. So another thing is, when you have a big space advantage, as already mentioned, it makes it difficult for the opponent to maneuver and improve their pieces, because you just control a ton of those squares. Notice here that the knight had to go back to c1, because that's one of the few ways to open up space for the bishop to develop. But also, when you have a big space advantage, it's usually good to try to take away, reduce, or eliminate the pawn moves that the opponent could potentially play that would attack your center. So one of the moves white could have played, if they got to, was the move f4. F4 would attack our center. But by playing bishop d6, I make that move more difficult to accomplish. So if I don't let them attack the center easily, then that means that my center stays well secured, and it's a lot harder for them to deal with it. So they played knight back to c1. They're going to play bishop to e2 next move. I don't really think there's a whole lot I can do to stop that necessarily. I could play a move like h5, just gaining more space, potentially trapping the bishop on the g3 square with h4. I don't know if it's all that necessary or all that important to do. I don't think I'm in a rush to do that, quite honestly. I think I'm just going to develop the knight. I don't really see a reason not to do that. I could also develop the knight to e7, which also looks perfectly good. I think I'm going to go to f6, though. It aims at the center a little bit more of an active location than e7. So we'll go knight f6. Now, the big question here in this kind of middle game that's going to be upcoming, assuming that white doesn't just blunder a piece in the next few moves, the question is going to be how to make progress. Like, what's the next step in the position here? So what you usually want to do when you have a big space advantage is you want to think about which part of the board your space advantage is kind of primarily on or aiming towards. So if we look at the pawns in the center of the board, the e4 and e5 pawns, these are pretty symmetrical. These are like equally faced off against one another. However, the pawn that's furthest forward in our position is the d4 pawn. The d4 pawn is on the queen side half of the board. We also have pawns on c5 and b5 that are over on the queen side half of the board. So our main bulk of our space advantage is going to be in this queen side direction. And for that reason, you usually want to play where your space advantage is. So we're actually going to play most of our moves around the queen side as the game goes on. Now, ways that you can do that, one way of doing it is to identify potential pawn breaks that you have in the position. In this particular case, we look at our opponent's pawns that have advanced off of the starting squares. We look at where those pawns are aiming, and these are going to be the pawn break opportunities, you could say. Now, we don't have a D pawn that can go to D5. Our pawn has already moved up to D4, so D5 is not really much of an option. F5 is a bit more on the king side part of the board, so that's not our priority. But C4 is on the queen side part of the board. This is a move we could definitely work towards playing at the right time. It will need preparation, though, because white has that square covered pretty well. So, in terms of playing on the queen side, we can also make a move like queen a5 check, which is kind of awkward for white to defend against. They can't push the pawn because we would win that pawn on c3. They could block with the queen. I don't know if I necessarily am in a rush to trade the queens, though. So I do need to speed up a little bit here. I'm going to go for bishop e6 first. This is going to help to facilitate the c4 push at some point in the near future. And my game plan is probably going to be, like, let's castle, swing a rook over, maneuver this knight towards the queen side, and try to play the move c4. That's the game plan I'm going to lean towards. So he moves a bishop again for the, third time here, attacking the knight. Part of my plan was to move the knight towards the queen side anyways, so I don't really want to let him take and double my pawns, so I'm just going to retreat the knight, move it over here, and it's going to help me to push that pawn up to c4, and that's going to help me to open up the queen side portion of the board. And again, a big issue for white is just the piece activity is severely lacking here. So, do I want to throw in the queen a5 check? I think I'm still going to hold off on that. Maybe I will do it. Bishop to g4 is actually a slightly annoying move that white could try to play. They could try to trade off their bad blocked-in bishop for my bishop that is not blocked in by my own central pawns. That would be relatively annoying to have to deal with. I actually have a way of stopping that, though. It's a little bit of a weird way. I'm going to play the move h5. It's not exactly setting a trap. I mean, if white takes the pawn, they will have two bishops stacked up on one another, and maybe the move g6 will win one of them. But it's mainly geared around stopping white from trading off my very good bishop that I have. So I might play g6 to reinforce that pawn, and I'm really just trying, once again, to restrict all of the pieces that white has here. I also need to speed up quite a lot at the same time. So I'm going to go g6 to reinforce that pawn. And then I'm going to work towards that c4 move once again. Probably going to castle the king. Okay, they go knight to b3. I'm going to go knight to b6. Try to support the c4 move. Maybe bishop to e7 to trade off my kind of blocked-in bishop. Also makes a lot of sense. Okay, I'm going to speed up here, though. I do get to play c4. We kick the knight. The knight has to go back to the d2 square, most likely. And then I think I'm just going to go ahead and I think I'm just going to castle here. The pawn on c4 is defended, so we're not worried about that. And if white tries to sacrifice, I can always push the f-pawn and open up my queen to block up the to come defend over on the king side. Okay, so white pushed the a-pawn, we push our pawn, stop them from pushing the pawn to a5 and eliminating our defender of this pawn. He goes knight to a3. I think I'm going to just eliminate this knight, quite honestly. They are threatening to take on c4, which is kind of annoying. Knight to b5 is also an option. Maybe, though, instead of that, I might just go knight to b4. I don't mind this trade of pieces, primarily because it's not my greatest bishop in the world anyways. And I'm also still maybe threatening to take this pawn on a4 at the right time. d3 is also an idea to push up the board. So taking on c4 is not safe to play. I have enough coverage on this square. And we are going to now be ahead a piece. Gonna have to speed up a little bit. Sorry about that. I would love to give a little bit more explanation in depth. I'll give more explanation when we analyze the game afterwards. But I'm just going to be grabbing free material. If the queens get traded, I will eventually push the d pawn down the board, since that is my passed pawn in the middle. All right, we're trading the queens. We're going to get a rook on the c file. Invade, take a pawn, try to push the d pawn. Yeah, so our main win condition, aside from having the extra knight, is going to be pushing the d pawn up the board as things go on. So let's get a rook on the second rank, double the rooks up, and then push the d pawn down the board is the idea. Okay, rook on the second rank. I am pre-moving a capture here. If he takes me on c2, I will recapture. And again, just trying to push the pawn up the board. If he takes the knight, I'll take back with the bishop. If he puts the rook here, I will pin the rook with bishop to c5. Okay, push the pawn. Next move, rook to c1. This rook cannot take the pawn since it's pinned. And next I'll take the rook, move the rook away, promote the pawn, and we will be up a queen very soon. Still have 21 seconds though, so I need to still play with some speed. The game plan here, of course, is once we get the queen, try to trade off the bishops. We'll have the only pieces left remaining on the board, and then try to checkmate white's king with our queen and knight combination. So I'll give a check here. Let's go here, take the bishop. Once the bishop's gone, we'll have the only pieces left on the board. We can grab this pawn here, attack the bishop once again. Take that, move the knight here, and there's nothing white can do to stop us from playing queen to g2, which will be checkmate. So yeah, we had to speed up. I had to speed up quite a bit there at the end of the game. I will go back and explain what I was doing there. Yeah, mainly wanted to prioritize the kind of opening and middle game phase. Hopefully, I was able to give some explanation there during the game. But yeah, once we get around to a bit of a time crunch, I have to speed up a little bit to make sure we get the win. So yeah, so e4, e6, knight f c3, d5, knight f3. And as we've seen in some of the other games, if white's not stopping us from putting the pawn on d4, we're going to push the pawn up to d4. Usually what white should do is play, d4 themselves, or trade the pawns and then d4. Usually you shouldn't be allowed to put the pawn on d4 so easily if white knows what they're doing. So we were able to put the pawn on d4. Then we played c5. I thought the knight e5 move was odd. I thought for a while to figure out what the best way to respond was. Queen c7 looked to be perfectly good. Other moves are probably good here in this position as well. Bishop d6 was one of my other alternatives, but I thought knight to c4, and I felt like I was going to have to just move the bishop again. It's probably still a pretty good position for black, though, at the end of the day. And I also thought that maybe pawn to f6 was pretty good, and then pawn to e5, but you always have to be a little bit cautious about moving the f-pawn. Probably Ben Feingold would not be too happy about the move f6. Anyways, though, so we go queen c7, knight moved, hit the knight, kick it over to the edge of the board, support that pawn. We don't want to play pawn to b4 here, because the knight's going to go right back to c4, and it's more difficult to kick this knight around at this point, because we don't have a pawn that can go back to the b5 or d5 squares. So whenever you're looking to advance pawns, it's perfectly fine to make advances that make threats, in the case of b5 as we did just a second ago. But you also want to be careful that you're not just, oh, I can make a threat, let me just automatically push the pawn without any regard for what they might do in response. So I want to keep the pawn on b5 because it's restricting his knight from moving forward. So that's why I played a6 to simply support the b5 pawn. Then we continue developing. Kick this bishop backwards, develop a new piece, develop a new piece, develop a new piece. We're just getting all of our pieces in the game. I decided to move the knight off of f6 so that they could not trade and mess up our pawns. And as I mentioned during the game, the big game plan that we're going to prioritize in this type of position where we have a very large space advantage, is we're going to prioritize the queenside play. This is where we have that big space advantage. This is where our pawns are aiming. This is kind of like, you know, in a sports sense, let's say, this is our like home field advantage. The queen side is where we're better. This is where we want to play. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to play on the king side half of the board, because where's our advantage? What's better for us on the king side? Not really anything. There's not really much that's better for white either, but it's a case of, you know, if we're better on the queen side, why play on the king side? So that's why, as the game progressed here, well, okay, I played h5 first. I didn't really want to let white play the move bishop to g4. Probably in hindsight, this isn't really a necessary move. I do want to point out real quick, though, that if white takes the pawn, then we can play the move g6, and we have this this lineup of pieces, and there's no way for white to save both bishops simultaneously. If you move one, the rook will take the other one. So it's not a free pawn for white to take. I was mainly trying to stop white from playing the move bishop g4. I thought if I castled, maybe a move like this is slightly annoying, because it is allowing white to trade off their kind of bad bishop for our good bishop in comparison. A bad bishop is defined as a bishop that is blocked behind its own central pawns, and a good bishop is the one that's not blocked behind their own central pawns. So my bishop is not blocked behind. My light square bishop is not blocked behind my dark square pawns, whereas his light square bishop is blocked behind his light square pawns. So this trade of bishops would help white out more than it would help black. So that's why I played h5 to stop it. Then I defend the pawn a little bit more. I do maneuver over to knight to b6, because, again, the game plan is to push the pawn up to c4, gain more space, and also we're trying to attack this little pawn chain that white has. Usually when you're attacking a pawn chain, you want to try to attack the further back pawns or further back points of the pawn chain. The goal is that if you can eliminate the furthest back point, then the next point up the chain becomes weaker. If you imagine the c2 pawn is gone, then d3 doesn't have pawn support. If you imagine that d3 is gone, then e4 is lacking pawn support. So that's kind of the idea here. So I eventually worked for the move c4. The pawns got traded, and now it ends up that the e4 pawn is lacking pawn support for the moment. I castled. And I do think white did a relatively good job of kind of fighting their way back in the game. Maybe in hindsight here, a5 was a little bit rushed. Maybe another move that's good here is like bishop to b4 to stop white from playing the a5 move. But okay, I went for a5. Knight a3 was a good move. They do attack my pawn, and also this fork on b5 could be a little bit annoying. But I didn't really mind the fork so much, because this is my bad bishop. Earlier we said the light square bishop was the good one. If you have a good bishop, that means that the other bishop is usually the bad bishop. So my dark square bishop is blocked in behind these pawns. I was not super unhappy about this trade of knight for bishop, because even though I do lose one of my bishops, it was my less good of the two bishops. So I wasn't really all that concerned about that possibility. In the game, though, white missed that as soon as I move the knight, I do also open up the queen to protect the pawn. I think white missed that idea, and so he ended up losing the piece. And now we're just up a piece for a pawn. And now the conversion phase starts at this point. We grabbed another pawn, traded the queens, eventually traded the rooks. And the game plan in these positions, even if I wasn't ahead the knight, my game plan would still have been the same. I want to use my extra pawn to advance down the board and promote to a queen. And that's what I did in this position. Push, push, pin the rook on the back rank. And once the rook is gone, then I get the queen, and then it's all about just grabbing more stuff and eventually getting the checkmate. Okay, so that's it for this game. Let's go ahead and get right into our next one. All right, so we're right into our next game here against Manos Castrinos, rated 830 from Greece. After e4, we're going for the French defense once again. They go knight f3, we go d5. This time they go for the move e5. So against the move e5, we have one main option, I would say. I do recommend the move pawn to c5 in this position here. Um, Essentially, if white gets the chance, they might want to play the move d4 themselves. And if white gets to play d4 in this position, it's going to be a perfectly fine French defense kind of advanced variation scenario where they've pushed the pawn from e4 up to e5. But I want to try to make this as difficult for white to accomplish as possible, is what it comes down to. So if we play the move c5 and they do play the move d4, then we can take the pawn and they'll no longer have a pawn on d4. So I'm going to play c5, kind of try to make it more difficult for white to get that pawn on d4 in the center of the board. They could try a move like c3 to kind of prepare the d4 move so that they have more pawn coverage on d4 when they do push. If they had done that, then we would go for the move d4 ourselves, just kind of squashing out that idea and gaining more space with our own move. But this particular player plays the move d4 right away. So I think we did have one game earlier in the Speedrun series where we had an opponent playing the same opening. Here we are going to make the trade of c pawn for d pawn. And it's mainly because white does not have a c3 pawn to recapture on d4. If they did have the pawn on c3 already, then we may not necessarily be in a rush to take on d4. But because they are able to recapture on d4 with the pawn, they are having to recapture with one of these two pieces, which means that the pawn on e5 is going to lack a little bit of protection. It's going to need to be protected by pieces rather than there being a d4 pawn to support it. And what that means is, as the game carries on, we can try to take advantage of this pawn being a little bit underprotected. So to begin with here, we're going to go for knight to c6. We develop a piece, attack the queen. Either the queen needs to move or white needs to pin the knight with a move like bishop to b5, for example. I think bishop to b5 is the most common move in the position, but this particular opponent goes for the move queen f4, which makes perfect sense. Now, the downside of the queen on f4 is that if I ever do maneuver the other knight to the g6 square, I will be attacking the queen on f4 as well as the pawn on e5 at the same time. So I like the look of knight e7 and then getting the knight to the g6 square where I can attack both of these things simultaneously. So I think in that regard, let's see here. Yeah, I think I'm just going to go ahead and play knight to e7 in this position. It is possible to play a move like knight to b4 here, which is actually quite awkward for white to defend. If they push the pawn, we can make the fork on c2. I will just point that out. But they could, I guess, play knight to a3 and protect it. And then my knight on b4 feels a little bit aimless. So I'm just going to go for the move knight to e7, put the knight on g6 pretty soon, and go about my day like that. So they go bishop e5. They do pin the knight. One idea to always be on the lookout for whenever you see a bishop on b5 and the king is still uncastled is there is this move queen a5 check that we could consider. Queen a5 check would fork the bishop as well as the king. Now, in this specific case, white has the move knight to c3 available to protect the bishop on b5. So I don't think we're really gaining a whole lot out of that. So I'm not in a rush to do that, really. I'm just going to continue with the knight g6 move. Hit the queen, put pressure on the pawn. I'm very happy if white takes the knight on c6, because we'll recapture and we'll have the pair of bishops, which is good for us. So probably white should move their queen off the f4 square. A move like queen to g3 makes a lot of sense, keeping the pawn on e5 defended. And then we'll figure out what to do if that happens. Okay, they go for queen to a4 instead. I don't think this move is as good. They do pile up on the knight on c6, which is pinned. But as soon as we play the move bishop to c6, bishop to d7, then white has a little bit of trouble dealing with the attack on the e5 pawn. It's also maybe possible to play a6 and even give up a pawn here, but I think bishop d7 just looks like the simplest option. The threat now is to take the pawn on e5, and it's easier said than done to defend against that. If white takes the knight on c6, we'll take back probably with the bishop, maybe even with the pawn. And then we'll have the pair of bishops, a very solid center, and we'll be in pretty good shape there. So they do take on c6. So do I take with the bishop or do I take with the pawn? Taking with the bishop, I'm sure, is what the large majority of people would kind of first lean towards, because, oh, I can recapture with the bishop and I hit the queen at the same time. Must be good. But I actually think I like taking with the pawn a bit more instead, because if you take with the bishop and the queen moves away, I still find it a little bit hard. I still find it a little bit hard to activate the bishop, because this pawn on d5 can't move forward without white winning the pawn. As soon as I say that, though, I am recognizing that if the queen moves away, maybe bishop to b5 could be very useful to stop white from castling. That might be a reasonable option as well. Now, I'm wondering if that's worth the idea here. My gut kind of tells me that pawn takes c6 is the better option, but specifically because white's not castled, it might end up that getting a bishop to b5 is a sufficiently annoying thing for them to deal with. So I think I'm going to go for that option here. Though it would not surprise me in the slightest if recapturing with the pawn was a little bit better. Okay, so if I was taking with the bishop and they're letting me play bishop b5, I feel like I kind of have to go for it. Again, may not be the absolute best way to play the position, but I like the idea of keeping them stuck in the center for a bit longer. So they could play knight c3 or knight a3 to attack the bishop, but I think I'll tuck it back on a6 and continue making it difficult for white to castle. Because if we keep the f1 square controlled, white is not able to castle their king because the king would have to pass through the f1 square. Okay, so here white played bishop g5 attacking my queen. On the d8 square. I could go queen a5 check. They could block with the knight, and then I develop a new piece. Looks very reasonable. Kind of leaning towards doing that. Queen to b6 and trading the queens is probably also fine. Queen to c7 and then bishop c5 also looks perfectly fine. I don't know. Does it make a huge difference? I don't know if it really makes like that big of a difference at the end of the day. I'm just going to pick one of them. Let's go for queen a5 check. If the knight blocks, I think I'm going to play rook to c8. Oops, sorry, rook to c8 then. If the bishop blocks, I guess I have to go back to c7. But I don't know if the bishop is that happy on d2 compared to being on g5. That's kind of my sort of understanding or assumption there. Okay, they block with the knight. I think my plan was to play rook c8. I don't have to worry about the bishop being captured since it's pinned for now. So rook to c8 looks reasonable. And then the next move might be bishop c5 to attack the queen. They go back to d2, okay. I could also go rook to c4, which is actually looking interesting. Because if the queen only has like very few amount of safe squares to move to, and there might even be some, maybe some rook e4 ideas one day. I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, let's go. I'm going to go for that. I don't see really the drawback for that situation. There, take, there, check. There could be some slight drawbacks, I suppose. Bishop c5 was my other move I was looking at, right? This one doesn't seem to have as many drawbacks, in my opinion. Yeah, I think I'm just going to go for this move. Develop and attack the queen. Get a new piece in the game. Get a bit closer to castling. Makes a lot of sense to do something like that. Probably the queen has to go to g4 is my assumption. That's the only safe square that I can see. Knight takes b5, opening up the attack on my own queen is also possible, and he does go for that option. But I think I can recapture on b5, and both the queen and the b2 pawn are hit. And it's kind of hard for white to guard both of those at the same time. If he goes queen to c3, then he's walking into this lineup of my rook, and we'll have some bishop takes f2 check, rook takes c3 ideas, since those two things would be hit. Anywhere else he moves, I think I'm going to take the pawn on b2. It could be a little greedy, but I think I can get away with it. I think I can get away with taking this pawn. I take there, castle, retreat. I could see some risk associated with this, I suppose, but I also can see some benefits at the same time. So I think I'm going to take here, then retreat the queen. Yeah, because now I'm in some danger of being trapped and kicked around. It is possible to take this pawn, but I'm always a little concerned about some checks on the b5 square later. So I think I'm going to retreat and then put the queen on c6 next move. Because I want to keep this check under control. And then I'm going to castle the king and be happy with my extra pawn. I'm going to have to speed up here a bit. Doing a lot of explanation on these positions. He goes knight to e5. I think I'm just going to make this trade. Maybe not, though. Yeah, let's make the trade. Then I'm going to castle. I need to get the king out of the center. And now the c2 pawn is a potential target. And maybe if I get a chance, I'll play b6 to block off the stuff on the b file. He could take on a7, but I think I'll take on c2 and attack the bishop. So he plays c3. He keeps that safe. I'm going to play b6 to block off his attack on these two pawns. I am still up one pawn. And probably next move, I'll go queen to c4 and try to trade the queens. With the queens off the board, it's going to become a lot easier to convert the extra pawn that I have. So let's go queen c4. He takes, I'll take with the rook. And also, if this queen on d4 disappears, then the pawn on e5 is going to be attacked at that point. So he takes, take with the rook, attack this pawn, as well as this one. He plays a5. I think I'll just take that pawn. And then I'll take the e5 pawn, put this pawn on a4, and we will be relatively smooth sailing there. Yeah, so this e5 pawn is the main one that I'm after. Okay, I will keep the a pawn alive for the moment. Get this pawn in the center. He can have the a7 pawn, not too much of a problem. But then I'll probably put the rook on the open b file. And we're going to be up 2 pawns in that position. Assuming he takes the a7 pawn. If he doesn't take a7, I might bring the knight back to protect it. So he's going to be left over with the weak c3 pawn. The bishop is going to be stuck protecting it. And I would really like to get the rook to the open file. Yeah, I'm going to do... Let's go... I need to play faster. I'm going to go rook to b8. If he takes this pawn, he's going to have back rank checkmate issues. He does rush a little bit for it. So now the problem is this rook on a1 is protecting the back rank and protecting the a4 rook. I will make the trade. And now the big issue he runs into is the back rank checkmate. He has to block with the bishop. And we do win the piece in this position. There's the checkmate. Okay, so going back through this particular game, I need to probably speed up a little bit on the explanations in the early stages because I don't want to be rushing through the explanations in the later stages as much as I feel like I was on these couple of games. But anyways, though, generally speaking, when the opponent has to recapture on d4 with a piece rather than being able to recapture with the pawn, it's usually a little bit of a favorable version of things for black to be in. Because here we got to attack the queen, and then we maneuver the knight, and we want to play knight to g6 and continue harassing this e5 pawn. Mainly, again, because there's no pawn on d4, the knight going to g6 and attacking e5 makes a lot more sense. if there was a pawn on d4, then I wouldn't be in a rush to go to g6. I might go to f5 and attack that d4 pawn instead. So in this version of things, though, we go knight g6. The queen went to a4. We block the diagonal. They take the knight. I took back with the bishop. I think my gut was telling me to take with the pawn. Probably both versions of the position are pretty good for black. But I decided to take with the bishop ultimately, and then play this bishop to b5 move. And we tried to make it as awkward as possible for white to castle their king as we could. So even though our queen gets hit, we check, we develop more pieces, we attack the queen. I was also looking at this rook to c4 move, but I thought knight takes b5, queen takes b5, maybe queen takes a7. Felt a little bit tricky for us. There's checks that we have to be a bit cautious about, and I wasn't 100% sure about this position. So I just decided to use the bishop to attack the queen instead. Knight takes bishop, we take, queen moves. I do go for the pawn on b2. I do think it's the best move, even though it does come with a bit of risk associated with it. If you didn't want to play it risky here, I do think you could trade the queens, castle, and I also think that black's position is a bit better and more solid here, because we have 0 weaknesses for white to exploit, whereas white still has some pawns that we can maybe put a little bit of pressure on. But that all being said, I do think it is safe to grab this pawn on b2, and then I ended up backtracking the queen, keeping the queen safe, making some piece trades, getting the king castled. And if white was to take the pawn on a7, I was going to take the pawn on c2, attacking the bishop, and then probably take the pawn on e5 pretty soon as well. And I think that we're going to be maintaining at least an extra pawn advantage in all of these positions, which is pretty good for us. So instead they played c3. I keep both of the pawns on the queen side safe with b6. And then from a position like this, it kind of feels to me that the queen on d4 is kind of the glue to white's position. It is the piece that is defending a lot of the weaknesses in their position here. So I would really like to get rid of their queen, because if the queen disappears, then the glue kind of comes unstuck and things start dropping off at that point. So that's why I went for the move queen to c4. Once the queens come off the board, I pick up an additional pawn, kept that pawn alive, picked up another pawn, and essentially in this position we're up 3 pawns at this point. White ends up making a huge blunder by taking the a4 pawn. They probably should take the pawn on a7, but even if they had done that, I think I might have played just something like h6. White can still not take this pawn because of their back rank issues, and in the meantime I'm going to, even if they solve the back rank, I'm going to bring the rook in, hit this bishop, try to win the c3 pawn. I would probably be relatively happy to trade the c3 pawn for the a4 pawn, because I would still have 2 extra pawns. If you look at this side of the board, I would still have 2 extra pawns over on the king side part of the board. So if I lose my weakness and they lose theirs, that's kind of a neutral situation, but I'm already up 2 pawns in the first place, so I'm pretty happy to just get rid of those weaknesses and focus on the side of the board where I have the 2 extra pawns. As it was in the game, they made a huge blunder here by taking the a4 pawn, and then because of the trade, they lose the protection of the back rank, and we get the checkmate. Okay, so that's it for that game. Let's go ahead and get right into our next one. All right, so in this game here, we're going to be going for our French defense, of course, e4, e6. Let's see what our opponent decides to do on move number 2. So they go for knight to c3. We're going to continue with d5, of course. And this particular opponent goes for the exchange of pawns. We will recapture in the center of the board. And they bring their queen out early in the game with queen to f3. Now, white is applying pressure to our d5 pawn. We definitely don't want to lose this pawn or allow them to capture it for free or anything like that. There's 2 main ways I would try to work towards defending this pawn. We can either play knight to f6 to protect the pawn, or we can play pawn to c6 to protect it. I suppose another option is to put the bishop on e6 and guard the pawn that way. And finally, it could also be possible to push the pawn forward, but I'm leaning a bit more towards developing a piece as well as protecting the pawn simultaneously. So I'm going to go for the move knight f6, develop the knight, especially when the pawns have been traded in the center of the board. You usually want to focus on your kingside development sooner rather than later, so that we can get the king out of the middle of the board, and maybe we can even get our rook to the e8 square to give a check on the opponent's king, who is in the center of the board. So they played the move d3. Not a great move. The downside of this is that their bishop on f1 is blocked in. If you're going to move the d pawn, it makes a lot more sense, in my opinion, to push the pawn all the way up to the d4 square. If you're going to do that, then then at least in that case, you're gaining more control of the center, and you're not blocking in either one of the bishops. So they went for d3 though. I want to develop this bishop off of the f8 square so that I can castle soon. So I think I'm just going to do... I could go bishop to b4, creating a pin, but probably white will play a move like a3 and kick my bishop around, and I don't know if I'm in a rush to necessarily take the knight on c3. It does mess up white's pawns a little bit, but I also lose one of my two bishops, and I might not necessarily be crazy about that. Another option is to play a move like bishop to g4 here, which is actually not a bad idea. Developing a piece, attacking the queen, kicking it around a bit. I think the more I'm looking at it, I think I'm just going to go for that. Let's develop a piece and attack the queen simultaneously. Force the queen to move away somewhere, whether it's g3, f4, or e3. Has to move to one of these three squares. And depending on where it moves, we might continue attacking it. If it goes to g3 or f4, we can bring the bishop to d6 to continue pestering it. If it goes to e3 and gives a check, here we're going to block with our bishop on e7. And now that the queen and the king are on the same lineup on the e-file, I'm even more looking for ideas like getting the rook to the e8 square to create a pin against the queen there. At the same time, we're also now threatening the move pawn to d4, which would attack both the queen and the knight on c3 simultaneously. So white stops that idea. They didn't walk into that tactic and allow that. But we're going to prioritize our development, and we're going to try to get the rook lined up with the queen and the king pretty quickly here, so that we can try to do some damage on the e-file. So let's see what white does about this. Probably they need to really just develop their kingside pieces ASAP, and they probably need to put a bishop or knight on the e2 square so that they can kind of plug up the e-file a little bit. So here white plays the move h3. They are attacking the bishop on g4. But this is a situation where we can actually ignore what our opponent is doing here, because our idea that we wanted to execute with this move rook to e8 and lining up towards the queen and the king, this is actually a more powerful idea, or a more dangerous idea, than white attacking our bishop on g4. I don't think there's anything really wrong with moving the bishop away, but I really like this idea of just ignoring what the opponent is doing and playing the move rook to e8 instead. The idea is that if white does take our bishop, we will move our bishop away somewhere, and then we will be pinning the opponent's queen along this e-file. So because we're ahead in development, because our opponent has kind of broken these opening principles and gotten themselves into a slightly dicey and tricky situation, we can get away with kind of ignoring their threats a bit easier, and kind of prioritizing our own play instead. So white plays bishop to e2. They probably should have played this a move ago, but they do eventually get around to playing it. I think it is probably white's best move. So we can move the bishop off of e7 pretty much anywhere, and it will open up an attack on the opponent's queen. Now, if we're going to move the bishop, I want to move it to kind of the most dangerous or most productive square possible, and I'm kind of leaning towards the bishop going to the b4 square, so that not only are we attacking the queen, but we're also pinning the opponent's knight on c3 at the same time. So I think I'm going to go for that option. Once again, kind of ignoring what the opponent's doing, making my own threat on the opponent's queen on e3. I think they're going to have to move the queen to d3, g3. I mean, they have a number of places they can move it to. But the question is, do we need to react to their threats still? Do we still need to react, or can we do something of our own at this point? We could just go ahead and trade the bishop for the trade off white's bishop on e2, but it does help white to develop an extra piece, and it does get them into a situation where they would be closer to castling at that point. So I don't know if I'm really in a rush to do that. I do notice here that because I pinned the knight on c3 a moment ago, there are potential ideas of playing like knight to e4, which would not only attack the knight on c3, but it would also attack the bishop or the queen that's on the g3 square at the same time. And I think we can go for this idea here. This is looking like a pretty interesting idea. If we go knight to e4, white could take the bishop on g4, but we can take their knight on c3. If they recapture on c3, we take with the bishop, and then we are forking the king and the rook. Once we take the rook, we will have lost our bishop on g4, but we'll have gained the rook on a1, and we would be ahead material. I think we would have also picked up a pawn along the way. So that's looking pretty good on first glance here. I guess after I take on c3, white doesn't have to recapture, but I think if they don't recapture, I'm still setting up discovered checks and attacking the bishop on e2 and stuff like that as well. So another idea here is just to drop the bishop back to the f5 square, avoid the trade, and attack the pawn on c2, which is not terribly easy to react to or defend against. But I'm kind of liking this knight to e4 idea. I think I'm going to go for this. Let's attack the queen. I assume the queen will take the bishop. We will take the knight on c3 at that point. And again, we're trying to control or dictate the pace of the game. Because we have a lead in development, because our king is safer, it's a lot easier for us to be the one that's calling the shots and attacking here, rather than reacting to what the opponent is doing when they're making these little threats and stuff like that. So it does show that white's disconnected. Kind of hope that they don't disappear. I don't think their position is lost right away or anything like that. I guess if the game does resign in a moment, then we'll talk about what they could have done to defend against this. But it ends up that they left and abandoned. So not really anything I can do about that, unfortunately. But yeah, let's go back here. So we'll go through the game. So it is our French defense. White played this early queen f3 move. Generally, these early queen moves are not all that great. Not only is the queen a bit misplaced, but we saw in the game that I was able to attack the queen a number of times, which allowed me to build a bigger lead in development. And this is usually one of the reasons you want to be very careful about bringing your queen into the game very early on, especially if you're putting it on a square where it can be harassed or attacked easily. So I protect the pawn, then I attack the queen. I move the bishop and block the check, but now I'm also threatening to make the fork with pawn to d4. If the queen had moved to g3 or f4 instead, I would have continued. Most likely, I would have continued attacking the queen. Maybe white could block with their bishop. I might trade. I might castle. And again, I'm just trying to get the rook to the e file and deliver a check as quickly as I can. And I think with our little bit of a lead in development, it's a little bit more of a pleasant position for black here. So instead, though, they went to e3. We block. We're threatening pawn to d4 now. They stopped that idea. We castle. And I think that this is kind of an important situation, as I talked about during the game, where even though our opponent is kind of attacking us first and they're putting pressure on us to begin with, we don't actually need to react to what they're doing. And if we can make a bigger threat or do something that's more dangerous than what they're doing, then we can actually ignore what they're doing. So white is attacking a 3-point bishop. When we play the move rook to e8, we are setting up the potential to win material here, is what it comes down to. For example, if white takes the bishop, my plan was to play bishop to b4. We are now pinning the queen, and there's nothing white can do really to save the queen. They might, I don't know, push a pawn or something like that. I would take the queen, they recapture, I move the knight away somewhere probably. And the main point here is that we are now ahead in material. We did lose the bishop on g4 and or rook, but we gained the queen. So in terms of kind of counting up the material, we lost a 3-point bishop and a 5-point rook, so we lost 8 points, but we gained the queen, which is 9 points, and so we are ahead, a point in this position. And not only are we ahead a point, but it's also probably a lot easier to play black's moves in this kind of position at the same time, because we still can attack and create threats and put pressure on the opponent a bit easier than they can do the same to us. So that was kind of my idea. And again, it tends to be the case that when your opponent's breaking opening principles, they're bringing their queen out early, they're moving the same piece a number of times in the opening phase. These are usually things you don't want to do, mainly because one of the most important things about the opening phase of chess is the concept of time. If you are ahead on development or have more pieces in the game, or if you can attack your opponent and they have to react to what you're doing, these are scenarios where you can kind of be ahead on time. Um, and you can kind of dictate the pace a bit more compared to your opponent when you're ahead in development or creating threats using the initiative and kind of using this concept of time well. So even though white's attacking us after this move h3, we haven't really done anything wrong in the opening. We developed pieces, we castled, we're controlling the center. If anything, it's white who brought their queen out early. They moved the d pawn 2 times, they moved an h pawn. They haven't developed, that many of their pieces. And so because they're breaking opening principles, that makes it so that we don't need to just play on autopilot or react to what they're doing. It's a lot easier for us to start attacking them and pushing them around because, again, we have more pieces in the game and we have this time advantage. So uh, in the game, we continued harassing the queen. I went for this knight to e4 move. White ended up abandoning the game. But if they had taken the bishop on g4, I think that is the move they should go for. I would have taken the knight on c3. If they recapture, we take and fork the king as well as the rook, and this would be a very good position for us where we're definitely ahead material. What they probably should do here is play a move like bishop d2, just not recapture the knight, and try to block off the pin or block off the line up towards their king in the first place. If they had done this, I think I was going to capture their knight on e2, or sorry, their bishop on e2. If they take my bishop, I'll probably take their knight, I suppose, and I will be ahead a piece with a check. So they would most likely recapture with their knight. I would trade. Now the king cannot castle anymore. And probably something like this is most likely a very pleasant position for black. White's king is uncastled. It's stuck in the center. I can kick the queen around. I can develop my pieces pretty quickly here. And black is going to be, at least a little bit better off here. I think it's very difficult for white to navigate a position like this easily. So this is probably their best case scenario. At least they wouldn't be down any material or anything like that. But yeah, in the game, white disappeared and we get the win. So anyways, though, that is going to be it for this game. This was the third game of the episode, focusing on playing against players between the rating range of 800 to 900. I guess this particular opponent was a tad bit over 900, but pretty close. And so hopefully you enjoyed the games in this episode. I will see you around in the next episode, and we will take a look at more games and play against progressively more difficult opponents as things go on. See you in the next one.